When a systemic crisis hits, the effects are immediate and undeniable. The water rises, the power grid fails, the housing market locks out a generation. We watch these disasters approach for years, and when governments fail to enact timely, systemic changes, we default to blaming corruption, incompetence, or a simple lack of political will. The actual mechanism driving this paralysis goes deeper. It is a structural failure in how human cognition processes information. This diagram represents the cognitive playing field where public policy is debated. On the left, we have the problem, measured in empirical data. On the right, the proposed systemic solution. This playing field is far from level. Problems and solutions do not occupy the same amount of cognitive real estate. This imbalance creates what researchers call the catch-22 of public solutions. To understand it, we have to map the precise nature of this cognitive asymmetry, observe how it traps policymakers in a loop of familiar failures, and track the inevitable life cycle of policy dilution. Grasping this mathematical framework explains why governments appear permanently paralyzed until the exact moment it is too late. We start by isolating the nature of the problem as a phenomenon in human experience. This timeline charts how we perceive time and risk. Notice where the problem sits. It is anchored exactly at T0, the present. A problem is an experienced reality. A 20% spike in inflation or a flooded neighborhood is visceral and objectively verifiable. You can flood the political field with problems because they require absolutely no proof of concept. They are already happening. Now look at where the solution exists. It is plotted in the future. A solution is entirely hypothetical.
Even backed by thousands of pages of rigorous modeling, it is an untested projection of a future state. To accept it, the public must make a cognitive leap of faith. Because of that required leap, solutions are structurally brittle. They are easily dismantled by organized campaigns of fear, uncertainty, and doubt. You can easily convince an electorate that an unproven idea will fail. You cannot convince them that the floodwater in their living room is fake. Media and information distribution systems naturally amplify this asymmetry. Problems are narrative gold. They feature clear victims, obvious villains, and immediate emotional stakes. Systemic solutions, by contrast, involve bureaucratic restructuring, carbon pricing models, or tax code revisions. They are slow, complex, and impossible to compress into a compelling 10-second soundbite. The structure of human attention guarantees that public focus will encode to the empirical panic of the crisis, rather than the abstract logic of the fix. Recognizing this massive cognitive disadvantage, policymakers attempt to compensate. They desperately modify their solutions to build public trust. This matrix maps how the public allocates that trust. Ideas that utilize existing, known systems gain high public trust, but they are highly ineffective at solving novel crises. Ideas that propose new, untested systems are potentially effective, but suffer from exceptionally low public trust. We can formalize this dynamic using three variables: the efficacy of a policy, the scale of a policy, and the trust the public places in it. This leads to the trust deficit of scale. As you can see by this inverse proportion, the larger and more comprehensive a proposed solution becomes, the less the public trust it. A comprehensive solution requires departing from the status quo. The further you move from the familiar, the more untested the policy is perceived to be. Scaling up the fix mathematically scales down the trust. This deficit introduces a completely separate problem for the electorate: the fear of unintended consequences or total systemic collapse. That secondary fear paralyzes the political process. Administrators respond to this paralysis by retreating. To gain enough trust to pass a bill, they ensure the solution relies on mechanisms the public already understands. There is a fatal logical flaw in this retreat. If the mechanisms society already knew and understood were capable of solving the crisis would never have materialized in the first place. By optimizing a policy to achieve public consensus, administrators structurally guarantee the resulting policy will be too weak to address the root cause. If bold solutions are feared and familiar solutions fail, society appears entirely stuck. How does any progress actually occur? It occurs through a mandatory pathway known as the law of solution dilution.
This flowchart tracks the 5-stage life cycle that systemic policy must cycle through when a crisis hits. First is the pure proposal. A comprehensive, mathematically sound solution is drafted, usually by think tanks or margin parties. The political center instantly rejects it as risky or unrealistic. The problem worsens. In Stage 2, center-left administrators introduce the first dilution. They water down the original idea, blending it with existing bureaucratic mechanisms so it feels familiar enough to retain public trust. That fails. In Stage 3, conservative leadership introduces the ultimate dilution. The policy is stripped down to symbolic gestures, greenwashing, or market subsidies. The root cause remains completely untouched. Because none of the diluted attempts solved the underlying math, the problem compounds. Society reaches Stage 4, the crisis horizon, a point of imminent catastrophe. These failures of governance are not accidents. They are mandatory political steps. Society must exhaust every single familiar option. True solutions are never implemented proactively. They are implemented only when diluted solutions can be diluted no further. When the dilution horizon is exhausted, society slams into Stage 4. The catastrophe is no longer a distant projection. It is empirical and severe. At this exact, precise moment, the overwhelming pressure of the crisis finally overtakes the systemic resistance to change. This triggers Stage 5, the adoption of the original idea. Let's return to the cognitive scale. The empirical data of the crisis expands rapidly. The visceral threat is now impossible to ignore. The weight of the problem becomes so immense that it completely ejects the public's hesitation. The theoretical blueprint loses its fragility. It becomes solid. Systemic action is triggered by one mathematical condition. The exact moment the public's immediate terror of the problem finally eclipses their fear of the untested solution. The threshold is crossed. The exact same pure solution that was mocked and rejected in Stage 1 is rapidly passed through the legislature, freshly rebranded as common sense, and defended as the only logical choice we have left. Reaching a catastrophic breaking point does not indicate a failure of the political system. Under the strict rules of human epistemology, a devastating crisis is the structural prerequisite for resolution.